Well, welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Charles Good. Our guest for this episode is once again Dan Ariely, who is the best-selling author of Predictably Irrational, The Upside of Irrationality, and The Honest Truth About Dishonesty. He is also the James B. Duke Professor of Psychology and Behavioral Economics at Duke University and is the founder of the Center for Advanced Hindsight. In this second part of my conversation with Dan, he continues to unpack the nature of our opinions, how they're formed, and how the forces of misinformation can distort them. He once again highlights how anyone, given the right circumstances, can find themselves pulled down what he calls the funnel of misbelief. In this final part of my conversation, we explore the remaining two elements of the funnel of misbelief, focusing on personality and social dynamics. Dan explains why certain personality traits can fuel misconceptions and how social influences such as ostracism and cognitive dissonance play a role. We also discuss the importance of trust in the realm of misbelief and conclude our conversation by me asking Dan why he believes that comparing ourselves to Superman should give us hope. Enjoy. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we engage with esteemed thought leaders and explore research-backed strategies and techniques that empower leaders at every level to achieve meaningful results that drive lasting change. Well, there's a tool that you have that I'd like to go into now, the dive model of perception management that helps you to slow down, because that's really what's needed. Slow down, pause, don't make any snap judgments, don't say anything you might regret until your more rational self regains control. So let's kind of talk about that. The first step or the first letter in dive, it's another acronym. It's not a linear process, so we don't go through it in a certain structure, is to where we proceed from to describe, to interpret, to verify, and to evaluate. But the first is really to describe, just describe what's going on, the emotions that you're feeling, right?
So the just because it's nonlinear, I'm going to kind of do it in a nonlinear way.
That's perfect.
So DIVE is a handy acronym, and that's why we use the term. And I didn't come up with it; it comes from the Peace Corps. This is actually a model that comes out of Peace Corps intercultural training. Uh, but so it was born out of the intercultural tradition where Peace Corps volunteers are going to locations where they don't really understand the culture very well, and they're part of the culture shock that we tend to experience is we see strange behaviors happening all around us, and we judge those behaviors based on our own set of values and sets and behaviors that we're familiar with from our home cultures. And so, one of the examples that I often give in this is it's a man, somebody who appears to be a man who's sleeping at his desk. And I ask people to say, what words come to mind, and things like lazy come to mind. That's actually the number one thing that comes to mind. Uh, some people say, had a rough night, which is, a little bit less loaded. Uh, but what's interesting is, nobody, or I should say very, very rarely does anybody comment on the fact that it's a person, that there's a desk, that there's a computer on the desk, that the person is wearing a red tie. So in terms of like, if you think about the I don't know which inspector this was from which television show, but the just the facts, ma'am, just the facts, ma'am, like sticking to the facts. What are the observable facts that we can all agree on, as opposed to, and that's the D in dive, describing. We're going to have I and E. That's interpretations and evaluations. Interpretation basically is what's going on here, what's the story, what's happening, and the evaluations are those judgments, which are often negative. So, because we are judging machines, we are generally going to just jump to those interpretations and evaluations. Like, I don't like that. And what describing does is it helps us sort of say, okay, that's great. I'm a human. I'm doing this. What's actually going on here? And then the verify comes up when, especially in a situation where I'm visiting a culture that I'm not familiar with, where I could find somebody who understands the culture better than I do. And I can share, like, I think this might be happening here. Can you explain to me what's going on? Put it in cultural context for me. My very first week that I ever spent in China as a 23-year-old, hot-headed 23-year-old white American man, I was in this store, a snack shop, and the storekeeper asked me two questions that I knew how to answer, like, where are you from and why are you here? But then she asked me this third question. She said, how much money do you make every month? And instantly, I just thought, what a rude, what kind of a question is that? That's an incredibly rude question. I don't remember how I actually answered the question, but I went back to the campus where I was teaching and I asked somebody there. I said, "Is that an okay question to ask?" Like it just seemed really rude to me. They said, "Oh yeah, it's a totally." She was probably just trying to figure out your relative status, and salary is a proxy for status, and we don't really care about privacy around financial matters. So that's an example of a process of verification where this fancy model, describe, interpret, verify, evaluate, it's helpful as as a model, but when it really comes down to it, what we want to be doing is constantly asking what else could be going on besides whatever that reaction is that I'm having to something. What else could be going on? And ultimately, that's to me what the dive model is all about. And then how do we get to other possible interpretations and evaluations of what's actually happening? And verifying is a really good way to do that.
Because in the end, we want our decisions and our actions to be inclusive and effective. And our stories that we make up about a situation, right? They shape our decisions and actions. So it's so critical to separate the fact from opinion from the interpretations and get verification on those so that we get a full understanding, a thorough understanding of any given situation.
That's exactly it. And in the workplace, those decisions and actions can affect people's livelihoods and a whole bunch of other stuff too. But we really, really want to be sure that it's effective and inclusive.
So we've talked about a lot of the power dynamics and gone into feedback. Want to kind of focus on now some of the inclusivity strategies, and you have some great strategies that you recommend for creating a more inclusive workforce, particularly in terms of communication and work style differences. So perhaps you can just give our listeners some insight in a few of those.
Sure. One of my favorite stories about this, favorite, it's still painful for me to relive because I'm kind of the bad guy. But early on in my time at the Center for Intercultural Leadership at UC Berkeley, so I was the first director of this center, and I wanted to try a bunch of stuff. And I had a colleague, two colleagues. So I'm going to give like the evaluations, the negative judgments that I had. They burst my bubble. They were wet blankets. They just weren't interested in trying new stuff. They were so timid. They said, "Jason, before we go doing all this stuff, could we please just have a half day retreat where we do some strategic planning?" And my reaction was so negative to that. Well, as it turns out, one of the common dimensions of difference that we find in the workplace is what's called a risk orientation versus what's called a certainty orientation. And not long after this initial incident happened, we actually there's an assessment that we used that kind of uncovered this difference. And once we were able to name it, because I have all these negative ideas about them, they got all these negative ideas about me too. Like he's reckless. He's going to lead us off a cliff. We don't even know where we want to go, and he's just like go go go. What kind of leader is this? Right? So we both got these very negative views of the others, and these are based on values that we perceive to be violated. So in my case, like I was really valuing speed and continuous learning. Like this is how you do it. And on their end, they're valuing. They've got a really strong value for certainty and for planning and for some degree of knowing what the consequences might be before you actually engage in the behavior. So the tension between risk and certainty on this team never went away. But what we were able to do, being aware of this difference, was first of all to name it. That's getting back to dive. That's like the description, the describing. These are just different behaviors, and they're based on a different prioritization of values. And we are going to bridge to one another. That is, I'm not going to just jump off the cliff. I'm actually, if there's something that I see that I think we want to do, let's have a conversation about it. Let's talk about what the potential upside is. Let's talk about what the potential downside is. And then on their end, there was a willingness on their end to be like, we could maybe stretch ourselves a little bit further than we thought we could. Maybe try some things that we might not otherwise have tried. And because I was the leader of that team, I really took it upon myself to make sure that I continually did that bridging to their preferences as much as I could, because for all the reasons we were talking about in terms of power dynamics, because the norm would be just for the leader to plow right ahead and do things their way. So this whole risk certainty, difference. That's one of a family of differences that are called cultural dimensions. There's conflict styles that differ. There's leadership styles and followership styles that differ. There's so many lenses that you can put on these differences. But from the standpoint of leading and what really matters, and as far as a skill to develop, not just for leaders, but also for teams and organizations, is learning to recognize and name the behaviors and the values that they're based on, and then employing various what we call bridging strategies for adapting what we do, changing what we do away from whatever that amygdala would have us do and having power run roughshod over everybody, and towards something where we're doing a lot more mutual bridging.
And even a simple tip that I found to be effective is just to listen when they are sharing their experiences with us. Don't try not to have any unpleasant feelings. Don't speak. Don't lash out. Just keep listening and accept that their experience is real. Correct?
Absolutely. And I would say, with one friendly amendment to what you said, which is the feelings are just kind of going to be there. I think it's to me, it's the art is more in naming the feelings and letting them pass and not acting on them. That's the hard part. That's the hard part. But the feelings are probably going to be there. And also, this is another piece of this, which ties in really, really closely with power and especially with privilege as well, is that we get so caught up, as at least in the culture here in the United States, we're so concerned about being a quote unquote good person that we can't even get ourselves into a conversation about privilege because we're afraid that we're going to get called out and shamed for not being a good person. There's all of these feelings that are just ready to jump out. Defensiveness and shame being two of the biggies. It can be really helpful to recognize that everybody plays a role in systems and that everybody is a product of systems. So, how could I reasonably expect, as somebody who grew up in the United States with its deep history of racial division and oppression, I'm just picking race because it's eternally salient here in the United States, as it should be, in the sense that we need to learn more and more and more about it and talk about it a lot more than we have been able to. How could I not have burned into my brain negative racial biases? Of course, they're going to be there. It's not my fault that those biases are there. And we can interrupt it right there, because we often can't even get that far because we don't want to admit that we have racial bias, because suddenly that means that I am a racist. We make this huge leap from there's an unconscious part of my brain that has a bias to I am this particular kind of bad person. If we can just stop and recognize that we are products of systems, and it's not some character flaw that has created those biases, it's the systems that have created those biases. And that awareness of those biases is a gift and opens up a whole other world of different ways of doing, of acting, of behaving in the world that has a completely different kind of an impact than if we're not even willing to enter that conversation in the first place.
Well, that's so critical to note that it's not our character, it's the system that we were a part of. So that people just don't feel like, well, you're just assassinating my character now, right? I can't do anything about that. Versus this is, the geographic location I grew up in or the country or whatever the case may be. The other thing that I hear a lot is I hear a lot of the non-marginalized groups, the dominant groups, I'll call them, they feel like it's up to the marginalized identities to educate us, which in reality, we should be educating ourselves. There is a world of information and resources at our fingertips. So we need to take more of that responsibility and be more proactive in learning. Harvard, I think, does the implicit associations test. And I was shocked when I took some of those tests because once again, I have that same feeling, I don't have any racist biases. I'm a good person. But when I saw some of these come to light, I'm like, wow, that's illuminating. It made me more self-aware. And then I was able to hopefully move forward in a direction to minimize that.
I really appreciate you sharing that, Charles, because like I think what you just did is you're modeling a different way of approaching this. You you were actually just really vulnerable right there in sharing the result of the implicit association test. Whereas, first of all, you even go there and then take the test, not try to wish away the results, and then actually try to reckon with them. That's what we need. That's what we need more of. And to go back to what you said just prior to that is so incredibly crucial, is that we don't rely on the people who have the more marginalized identities to educate us. That is emotional labor that is not fair or right to ask of them. We have no excuse. In 2023, there is so much information available. There are so many incredible books and podcasts. I'm constantly learning because it's endless. There's so much to learn. And the stuff is just out there at our fingertips. We just need to be proactive. We need to care enough to actually go and do that learning and then to carry that into how we behave, to our actual behaviors.
I'm in complete agreement. Before we end the podcast, I want to just touch on how we adapt to cultural differences, because in a global world right now that we live in, what are some effective ways for leaders with more power to adapt to the norms and preferences of different cultures, which they have more commonly in their organizations now that they're multinational and global corporations?
Even in organizations, just even a local organization where everybody's from the same town these days, you're going to have a lot of differences show up. A lot of cultural differences show up too. So, we tend to associate this word culture and intercultural with global. And yes, that's cultural differences still exist at the level of the nation state. And that's all really important. But there are studies that have claimed to show, and I say claimed because I don't know about the quantitative methodology, but that urban rural differences inside of countries are greater than differences outside of countries. Just to take one example, and we know that culture varies based on gender and race and religion and so many other dimensions as well. So all that to say, differences everywhere. And so this is another piece of the puzzle here. We have norms. We have behaviors that are considered better than others to talk about the systems that exist, right? So, for example, in US business culture, the preferred way to communicate is what's called low context communication or direct communication. You're supposed to say what you mean and mean what you say. And if somebody is a more high context or more of an indirect communicator, we tend to disparage and pathologize that behavior as something passive aggressive or sometimes timid or something like that.
Or what if you get someone that says that, hey, I'm just being honest, right? I just say what I feel and think, and I'm just being honest with you. I've almost said, that's just giving you an excuse to be rude to someone, right? It's not something that you want that kind of transparency for in a normal workplace or personal setting.
Yeah, it's an interesting example. I'd say that, in order for me to opine on that example, I would have to know more about like what's the situation in which that person is saying that. What's the nature of our relationship? Is this somebody who has a history of really caring about me and demonstrating care about me, or is this somebody who maybe has a history of undermining me? Right. So we need all the context there. But all that to say, so I think one of the things you're pointing to there is like one behavior. You just kind of described a behavior, right? Can be interpreted in so many different ways as well. But also, I'll give a quick story just to illustrate this. I had a direct report of mine once, and I write about this in the book, Anita. We had one-on-one meeting every week. She was like a dream employee. She was so good at her job. I didn't have to worry about her. But we had our one-on-ones, and she would use the one-on-ones. I really considered it her time to kind of tell me what she was up to and ask for help with anything that she might need my help with. It didn't take long for us to establish a pattern. She would start telling me a story, and I could feel the low context or direct communicating part of my brain, the value being efficiency, and thinking, this is so inefficient. Can you please just get to the end of the story and tell me what you need to tell me so we can get on with what we need to do? Well, one day she caught me looking at my watch, and there was this pause in the conversation. She says, "Do you need me to finish my story?" And I felt this kind of shame wash over me, and I was like, "Yeah, go ahead." But at that point, it was sort of the magic was gone, and we didn't talk about it then. But the next meeting, we actually debriefed it a little bit, and her take on it was, I just feel like if I don't tell you these stories, how do you know what I'm actually doing? And it was such a reasonable question for her to ask. I couldn't deny that there was value in the stories themselves. And so what I learned to do was not just kind of pro forma, fake it till I make it, let her finish her story and then get to what really counts. I actually learned to appreciate her stories as a window into her world, as a window into the work that she was doing, and actually helped me appreciate even more what she was doing. So that's an example. That is one success story of a leader, in this case me, who bridged to a colleague who had less power than me, and was able to create a space where she could be more of her authentic self. And anybody who reads the book will see that there's plenty of non-success stories in my own leadership as well. But that's one example. Since you're asking what are some things that leaders can do. That's actually one example, I think, where it worked out pretty well.
When you're so right with the fact that culture, I mean, I kind of made that very black and white definition that, we have one culture here in the US and other countries have different cultures, but there's so many different cultures between urban and rural, like you were saying, men and women. I mean, that's these cultural differences are everywhere, and we shouldn't put them in a box, but make sure that we're aware of those nuances in the cultures that people living on our same street, within our teams, in our community, in our environments, are coming at problems and the environment and reality from a different perspective with different values.
Exactly. And one comment on the values as well, because this is also something that can tend to kind of get lost in the shuffle of all of this, is it can be really helpful. I found this, that it can be really helpful to identify the values that are driving behaviors that I find bothersome. And the reason is, whatever those values are, I probably share them. I just rank them differently in whatever context. So an example is, let's take there's a conflict style called accommodation, which involves a indirect communication and emotional restraint, which is the opposite of mine, which is called engagement, which is direct communication and emotional expressiveness. My natural, unconscious, unintentional reaction to an accommodation conflict style is they're being passive aggressive. Well, one of the values that drives the accommodation style is harmony, and also saving face and not embarrassing people. Well, I like harmony. I think it's nice not to embarrass people. In conflict situations especially, I just wanna my values for authenticity and transparency and efficiency drive me to be emotionally expressive and be a direct communicator, and in the moment, those matter more to me than harmony and not embarrassing people. But if I'm able to identify those values, it's not that I wanna go embarrassing people and that I don't want any harmony. It's just that in that context, those values are ranked a little bit lower. But if I can identify the values, that gives me a point of entry into somebody else's reality where I can appreciate why they have the style that they have, and I don't need to feel so threatened by it.
That's an important distinction. You're right. If you can dig down into those values and you can really understand their behavior and where they're really coming from and have a more inclusive behavior, hopefully, or relationship as a result. Before we end, I always like to leave our listeners with a call to action. So, what's one key skill or tool that we've shared today, or maybe not, that leaders should develop to become more aware of their own power?
I think do an inventory of the dimensions of your own identity. I hate talking about this in the second person because I always feel like I'm right there with other people. I don't want to tell people what they should do. So I guess what I'll say is I have found it helpful to consistently revisit my own multi-layered privilege. And the reason that I think it's important to do that is because it's so easy to forget, because it likes to hide in the shadows. And because it also reminds me that it's really another road that's really easy to go down, that's not a helpful road, is, oh, this work is so hard and there's all of these uncomfortable feelings that I'm having to deal with that I never had to deal with before, and can we please just go back to how it was before I had to have all these uncomfortable feelings talking about my privilege. When I stack that up against the day-to-day reality of people with less privilege than me, the day-to-day suffering and dying that happens because of differences in privilege and the systems that enforce those differences, I can still validate my feelings because I think it's important to validate feelings, but that's not what this is about. That's not what this is about. This is about improving human well-being. And so this sort of this inventory that I'm talking about of my privileged identities, it's not to like, self lacerate or anything like that. It's just not about me, but it helps put everything into context and helps to keep me motivated to continue to do this work because of what I just said. I'm going to end up repeating myself because if we're serious about, we say we want a more just and a more equitable world. What am I actually willing to do in order to do that? It keeps me in that conversation, the action conversation. So that's my one piece there. That at the
Great advice. And I love, what you just said regarding having that power makes you more susceptible to those tendencies. Be aware of those. Listen with an open heart. And like what you just said about self-lacerating, you're going to mess up. So show some kindness and compassion to yourself when you do, so that you don't get too discouraged and you keep the course.
Exactly.
Thank you, Jason, so much for joining me today. It was a pleasure talking through these issues with you. Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you and learn more about your work.
Yeah. So I'm fairly active on LinkedIn. You can just put Jason Patton, search me up on LinkedIn. I have a website, jasonpatton.com. I do some blogging there. I have a page there about speaking engagements. I have a page there about the book. You can look up Humanly Possible on Amazon.com if you want to get it. These days it's pretty easy to find.
If you like this episode, then please share it on social media and consider leaving a review or rating. If there are specific leadership topics or industry leaders you'd like us to feature on the podcast, we are welcome to your suggestions. Remember, knowledge's transformative power is only activated when it is acted upon. So what actions are you going to take on the insights and knowledge shared in this episode?